And welcome to today's Exeter Institutogram conversation with me, Sajjad Rizvi from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Today I'm going to be in conversation with an old friend, Lisa Alexandrin from the University of Manitoba, and we will be discussing her very intriguing title. I'm just waiting for Lisa to patch in so we can start our conversation. Just waiting for the connection to happen. Right. Should be any second now. It's been accepted on both sides, so we're just waiting for the connection to come through. As I said, Lisa is a professor of religion at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg and has written extensively on Ismaili philosophy and also increasingly on Sufism. And today we'll be talking about her work, particularly in Sufism. Just waiting for the... Okay, right, let's see. Go through, so let's just try it again. Oh, hi, Lisa.
Hi. Yes, as we were talking earlier about internet connection, and so very nice to be able to join you today.
Okay. Thank you. It's good to see you. I was just going to continue my introduction to say that it's a real pleasure to have you on as the last of these conversations that I'm doing before I hand over to my colleagues, because out of all of those I've interviewed, we go back the longest. And not
Right,
to kind of give away our ages, but you know, I think we've known each other for almost 25 years.
that's
So,
I was thinking about those early philosophical gatherings and conferences, and
yeah, those rather strange meetings with Parviz Moravich, upstate New York.
that's
Yeah.
right.
Well, anyway, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, and we'll be, of course, talking about your research and this intriguing title you gave us. Instead of kind of starting with the background, how you got to this, because I'm sure we'll get to that anyway, let me start with the obvious kind of question. Well, two questions. One is, who is Sa'd-ud-Din Hamuyeh, who you've mentioned in your title? And I guess the second related one is, what do we mean? You give me the title on the question of shadow forms and their presence. So that obviously begs the question of what do we mean by shadow forms and their presence. So over to you.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. Again, when we think about the 13th century in the Islamic world, when we think about major thinkers, intellectual giants, so to speak, within Sufi traditions and philosophical traditions. And so what we know primarily about Hamuyeh comes from the accounts of other Sufis who are living at the same time. And we also have a biography that was written by his great-grandson, who gives us a lot of information about Hamuyeh's studies with different Sufis like Najmuddin Kubra, his meeting with Kolnovi and Ibn Arabi, and then his travels in between what we would call like the Persianate world and Jerusalem and different parts of like Syria. So it's quite interesting to think about his biography in the context of the 13th century, and then who was he in terms of the development of the Kubravi Sufi tradition.
Mm.
He's studying with Najmuddin Kubra, but also sort of setting out on his own in
Right.
terms of developing some aspects of what we later call the Kubravi Sufi tradition.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, just to kind of follow up one thing on that, obviously most people will probably not have heard of Hamuyeh. But I think it's probably fair to say that in the Kubrawi tradition, he's quite a well-known figure.
Oh yeah, so it's also like very contentious.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of gossip about Hamuyeh, especially like, from later authors who really question what were his teachings. And one of the things that seems to have made him very controversial was his views on messianism, and also more specifically related to the appearance or manifestation of a messianic figure at the end of time. So this is quite interesting for thinking about Hamuyeh, but then also thinking about in the 13th century, there are certainly a number of different thinkers, again, intellectual giants who were really questioning what messianism
Mm.
was or is, and what about this messianic figure.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I think
Um,
we'll probably come back to that, but to do
yes,
continue.
definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah, so I actually like when I was thinking about the title for our conversation, I had a lot of like first thoughts, and in some ways, I was also thinking about this fact, like I just mentioned in terms of Hamuyeh's biography, that Hamuyeh is in a sense really overshadowed
Mm.
by Ibn Arabi, and Ibn Arabi is the great master,
Mm.
and we recognize so many things about 13th century Sufism from what Ibn Arabi gave us in terms of his works. So that's definitely like an important historical fact to give consideration to. And then I was also thinking about you know, how both Ibn Arabi and Hamuyeh in the 13th century were giving a lot of consideration to how to understand God and appearances.
Right.
So I think it's nice, fortunate in a sense, that we can consider what are these shadow forms and presences now, as we share our thoughts and have conversations in virtual reality.
Yeah.
We might also start to wonder to what extent are we becoming spectralized by our
Right. Yeah.
screens?
Yeah.
How do we locate ourselves as forms and shapes in these meeting spaces that are tethered to technology? And I think in some ways, this question of like, are we like ghosts or shadows, would be something that both Ibn Arabi and Hamuyeh would appreciate, um, in the sense that they had some modern considerations in their
Mm.
shaping of Islamic thought and Sufism. So I think this gives us a chance to kind of think about some different things again,
Mm.
like I keep saying like Ibn Arabi and then Hamuyeh.
Yeah.
You might maybe have some questions about that, like
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
what is the relationship? I mean, is there an influence going a particular way? Are they drawing on similar kinds of sources? You know, how do they, and even on the question of like presence and absence, or
Mhm.
you know, physical presence and kind of shadows and so forth. I mean, are they saying similar kinds of things? Are they influenced by esoteric Ismaili thought coming from Andalusia, as some people have suggested? What's going on there?
That's a really good question, and I've been spending a lot of time. Oh, I've been spending so much time, especially like in the past couple of years, as our esteemed colleague Paul Ballenvot and I have been working on this critical edition of Kitab al-Mahbub.
Mm.
So we know for sure that Hamuyeh and Ibn Arabi met in Damascus.
Right.
And someday maybe this would make a wonderful Turkish TV series in terms of the
Yeah.
history of Sufism. So they definitely met, and definitely in terms of thinking about a turning point in Hamuyeh's thought. His meeting with Ibn Arabi definitely catalyzed some aspect of his thought, but we see um, a real departure um, from Ibn Arabi in Hamuyeh's later works, especially the Kitab al-Mahbub.
Mm.
So we have a sense that both Ibn Arabi and Hamuyeh are interested in this question of appearances,
Mm.
um, form. They're thinking also about the barzakh and how that works. And we can also see that, in a sense, both of them are giving what I believe like are best known scholars of Ibn Arabi today would call a typography or a mapping of reality.
Right.
So that
Yeah.
would include what is coming to visibility, what we can see, and then what is also unseen. And this covers all aspects of God's creation. Um, Going back to thinking about this idea of the shadow forms and
Mm.
presences. Can see a lot of similarities between Ibn Arabi and Hamuyeh in that respect. So Ibn Arabi has a lot to say about shadows and shadow forms, and so does Hamuyeh. Ibn Arabi in Futuhat, volume 7, page 412, talks about the image of the perfect human being
Mm.
in the unseen and the likeness of a person's shadow, which is a lovely image. And then Ibn Arabi mentions elsewhere in the Futuhat that all of God's creation bows in sujud to God, and
Mm.
so are their shadows bowing. And a person's shadow, again, to give another example, which is very meaningful, when extended, merges with other shadows of other people standing in front of them. And we see in Ibn Arabi this as a consideration of form, and is also in consideration of how he's thinking about the letters. And
Yeah.
then we can see in terms of Hamuyeh that this question of shadow presences, shadow forms emerges again in relation to the human form, but also in terms of the letters, how
Yeah.
they come to appearance or visibility, what is seen is what is unseen. So it's
Yeah.
very interesting to think about something hidden in appearance and then appearing, and how that might be translated in terms of um, the physicality of things, the presence of things.
Mm.
Oh, but I should mention um, that in some respects, at least from my perspective, Hamuyeh is very messianic.
Yeah.
And so once we put that into the equation of thinking about appearances or shadows and forms and presences, um, I would probably say like what is rising to visibility is coming from a flat line of the aleph, the letter A for Hamuyeh. And it kind of works with that, with a sense that all of the other types of limits have been somehow lifted
Right.
from consideration. I don't know if that really makes sense. What do
So,
you think?
so what? So what? Like the aleph is kind of infinite. It's an infinite sort of starting point almost.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it
yeah.
is. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, I mean that I suspect that has kind of all sorts of parallels in mystical traditions. I mean, I think even Kabbalistic stuff on the Aleph has similar notions of the Aleph as the infinite whole, right? Or
right.
or the connection between 2 points, sort of divine and well the mediating the divine and what is masewala, to use the Arabic phrase. And also, I mean, you have, I guess, similar kinds of arguments about the parallel between the aleph and one as a number. So
Right.
it's not, one is strictly speaking not a number, and in that sense, aleph is not necessarily even alphabet. It's like the totality of what is inscribed. Um,
Yeah, and it's like in terms of visual examples
yeah,
that we find in Hamuyeh in his largest work, the Mahbub, but then also in the shorter treatises. So this the idea of like the aleph as a flat line, but then we can kind of think about it in relation to this intermediary, and an intermediary where things are kind of moving
mm,
back and forth from visibility to invisibility. And so it's
yeah,
kind of a nice idea, like the aleph as a straight line,
yeah,
has a very distinct form to it. But then we kind of get this sense of motion where when things are moving into visibility, that they might be leaving behind some kind of trace or shadow, which I think would be significant in terms of thinking about, well, does the shadow have a presence? And
yeah,
how long does it hold that presence? And these are things that, in a sense, when we kind of look at Hamuyeh's unedited works, we see him trying to give a typography,
right.
an imagery through the diagrams that he's presenting in his treatises
Uh,
of how that actually
Are
works.
these, in terms of these diagrams? I mean, it's interesting because uh, the ones that I'm familiar with in a slightly later period is you've got lots of these kind of mandala kind of diagrams by someone like Sayyid Haydar Amuli. right?
Mm, yeah, yeah.
Um, and I guess there would be more kind of calligraphic ones, which would be, so coming out of that calligraphic tradition of understanding what calligraphy is and linking it with, sort of a mystical understanding of the world. So, is it a mixture of those two, or is it much more kind of a calligraphic explanation, or is it?
Ooh.
I mean, is the for example, do you have mandalas, or is it just about the letters?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we have like when I think about some of our colleagues who are working on different manuscript traditions, so we can definitely think about the development of diagrams in the 13th century onward. Hamuyeh is, again, like Ibn Arabi, really interested in using these visual screens to explain something primarily, I would say, and I guess I'm like, well, whatever, opinionated. I would say primarily to explain something about Quran and
Right.
name of God. And so, uh, could this be part of his Quranic hermeneutics? That's a very good question. Um, some of the diagrams are really kind of like circular.
Mm.
And does it say something about the individual viewing what's in the diagram and going from one part of a Quranic passage to another to the names of God? Are these resting stations? Are these to be understood as stations of understanding and comprehension
Yeah.
of names of God? How does that relate back to practice,
Right.
um, contemplation?
So I mean, that obviously raises the obvious kind of question that uh, so he basically sees the Quran and reality as kind of homologies.
Yeah,
So there's a sense in which you're reading the Quran and you're reading reality, so to speak.
exactly.
But is the key for that really the letters? Because I'm kind of wondering if, of course, we've heard quite a lot about letterism, and I had Matt on the other day, and we are talking about the occult. So, I mean, is the approach to that a letterist approach? Does that mean that, Hamuyeh is an occultist of some sort? Or is there the absence of a kind of, is it purely a kind of a contemplation, a reflection, or is there an actual, I guess, transformative practice going on there, which would put him much more in the occult or even scientific practice, the occult
That's
camp?
a great set of questions. So I probably would say for Hamuyeh that he later on is kind of working through some of the ideas of the letters
Hmm.
as first presented by Ibn Arabi, but then we can say maybe again there's a departure. So the reflection on the Quran and the contemplation of letters and the names of God in the Quran is like kind of depiction of some kind of visionary set of
Hmm.
realities. We could say in some ways
Hmm.
that was something that Hamuyeh was definitely giving voice to,
You're right.
particularly in his earlier works. And then later on, it seems that there's a real shift kind of thinking about all things in terms of what is rising to visibility, again, as part of contemplation. So
You're right.
just as the letters are rising to visibility,
Hmm.
parts of the Quran are rising to visibility for consideration. They also fade back and fade into annihilation, fade back into unity.
Yeah.
So, so there's this aspect of Hamuyeh that's a little bit wobbly.
I
Not
mean, certainly the first half of that sounds like, fairly standard kind of Sufi hermeneutics of the Quran, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And the whole idea of Zahir and Batin, or kind of the appearance and what is hidden under the appearance, and how you make sense of that text so that meaning arises. The notion of the had and the muttala, or the matla, in the famous
Right.
hadith.
Yeah. And
Uh,
and then, exactly. And then there's some aspect of his writings, especially in Mahbub, where like again it's very hard. Like he seems to kind of like um radically erase everything that he's presenting as a conception at the same
sure.
time that he's presenting something. And so the idea that something is going to rise into visibility is a kind of dispersal of something that's been distinguished,
Hmm.
and then at the same time it will fade back into Tawheed, and that has a lot of significance in terms of thinking about like him developing his own discourse
Hmm.
independent of other thinkers. Going back to the other points that you were raising is quite interesting in terms of the manuscript traditions for Hamuyeh.
Hmm.
They shed a lot of light on how his teachings were received
Right.
by other Sufis and thinkers. And so there's a sort of like aspect or a branch of the manuscript tradition in 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 Turkey, in the modern library collections in Turkey, where a lot of his short treatises are grouped together in Majmua with Boni, for example.
Right.
And
So
in
the
terms of like,
occultic, the occultist kind of
yeah,
yeah,
in
yeah,
terms of like the Iranian manuscript tradition, as far as we've explored it so far, it's again, there's sort of these clusters of like his treatises with Baba Afdal, Kashani, and with Buni again, with the sense that there's more to his works with respect to letterism than maybe Hamuyeh was originally
yeah,
considering.
yeah. I mean, I think this is often I guess we have increasingly this problem, don't we? That when we come across discussions of huruf, I think nowadays we get used to the idea, oh, this must be ilm al-huruf, right? This must be a particular kind of attitude towards not just the alphabet, but to reality, right? And maybe it's actually not that at all. Maybe it's something just, much more straightforward. So I think, and I guess maybe also when we're looking at someone like that in the 13th century, there are lots of ideas, in the mix, so to speak. And some elements of that become much more explicit and less explicit. So, it's a
Yeah.
bit like, if I were to ask you, is Hamuyeh a monist, like people, say that in Arabic? And I assume that's in some ways a bit of a crass question to ask, right? Uh,
But I mean, it's quite interesting for like we have a sense in the different Sufi works compiled after his time that there's, for example, Izzuddin Nasafi, a student of Hamwe, where there's a lot of like questioning, kind of going back and forth, like was he not, like what was going on, why was he presenting these ideas, and so there seems to be on the part of like some thinkers this real interest, like you were saying, in the letters, the letter mysticism, the letterism. What kind of application could this have in different ways? And then the question of like messianism for Azizuddin Nasafi, for Simnani. Hamuyeh's points on anything linked to messianism were very problematic.
yeah.
And we kind of see these ideas circulating in different contexts in terms of the Kubravi authors and other Sufi thinkers up until the middle of the Ottoman period. The kind
So,
of
I mean, was that stuff problematic because there was something which was, I mean, for want of a better word, but kind of heterodox, sort of Shi'i about that. I mean, by which I mean kind of maybe inclining towards Nusayri ideas or some elements of Ismailis. I don't mean kind of the 12 Imami sort of tradition. Uh,
yeah, I think um, I would probably say I think in terms of the contention. So I think part of it is how people were reading Ibn Arabi.
hmm,
how they were reading what Ibn Arabi wrote on this figure of the Messiah.
Right.
Have in Hamuyeh a lot of discussion about the seals, the seals of Walaya, the figure of the Mahdi, the
Mm.
figure of the Messiah, and sort of like complex question about this figuration of the messianic figure.
Right.
So this has a lot of resonance with, I think, Shiism from the probably like the pre-Fatimid period, the early Fatimid period,
Yeah.
and I think for like someone like Simnani, he was really unhappy with this idea that there could be some.
Oop. We've lost Lisa there. Let's try and get her back. Um, oh, yeah. Hi. Sorry, we just lost you there for a second.
Yes.
It's probably just the connection, but I think it's well, it's buffering, but I can hear you. No. Yeah. Um, it's just buffering there. I can hear you, but I the picture's frozen.
Oh yeah, that's the kind of connection, I think.
Yeah.
Um yeah, so I mean basically like there's a lot of different ideas that were developed in terms of like Sufi discourses on messianism.
Mm.
And Hamuyeh is shaping in his own way a messianic discourse, which was very appealing in some ways to Sufis in the Kubravi Sufi tradition as it formed and outside of the Kubravi Sufi tradition. And that was also very appealing to um, different thinkers of within Shiism.
Yeah.
Like Haider Amali in particular
Yeah.
had clearly read certain parts of Hamuyeh and was intrigued.
Well, I remember, if I remember correctly, that Amuli in the Jami al-Asrar.
It,
Um, can you hear me?
yes, yes, yeah.
I, I,
It's
I was
uh,
just going to say that Amuli in the Jami al-Asrar, I vaguely remember mentions Hamuyeh talking about the seals and the identification of the seal with the Mahdi.
Yes, exactly, especially in that work. And then it's interesting if kind of think about how Haider Amali is presenting perspectives on this. He kind of goes back and forth from um, different thinkers, and then Hamuyeh has a place as well in terms of this figuration of the messianic figure. And kind of going back to what you were saying and asking about before concerning like the diagrams and the use of diagrams. So we can kind of imagine in terms of Haider Amali that he has a much clearer like typography of how this would actually be visualized
Hmm.
than I would say Hamuyeh did when
Right.
Hamuyeh was writing about certain things. But again, it's possible that the diagrams in Hamuyeh's works are being used in very different ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Someone's just kind of commented that it's almost appropriate that you are occluded. You're in the shadows.
Well, especially because as you can kind of tell, as we've been having this conversation, I've been introducing more and more things with some sense of hesitation because we have like all of these different scholarly considerations that we
Yeah.
bring to bear to the works of these 13th century authors like Ibn Arabi. And I think about Hamuyeh and Hamuyeh being somewhat in Ibn Arabi's shadow. And
Hmm.
then in terms of like the work that Paul Ballenfot and I are doing,
Hmm.
to bring something into a concrete form. So, like in many ways, I think both Ibn Arabi and Hamuyeh give us a lot of material to consider, to give profound
Hmm.
consideration to, even even in our times, in terms of thinking about like what is the appearance of reality,
Hmm.
um, and how do we understand this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really interesting reasons, perhaps, why one should engage with people like Hamuyeh is that we sometimes, forget that because Ibn Arabi is such a massive presence, that there's a lot more going on in the history of Sufism, um, and certainly with respect to Sufi thought. And these, of course, have an impact. They have a continuing resonance in texts across the centuries, and certainly the Kubrawi tradition, as it then becomes, very much punches above its weight in the sense that it influences not just the various branches which come off from it, but also other orders beyond them as well.
Yeah, it's also like it's very interesting to think about readers and audiences from the 13th century onward of Sufi texts and what we would call very specifically like Kubravi Sufi texts, the works of tafsir, the collective tafsir project
Hmm.
of the Kubravi authors, and how that was read, how widely that was read, and then kind of going back to thinking about manuscript traditions and unedited works. It's almost as if the more people work on these different manuscript traditions in different library collections, we learn more and more about the transmission of certain teachings and ideas
Right.
linked to what we would call schools of thought, like the Kubravi authors,
Right.
like Hamuyeh. And it seems, you know, the more time that we spend on particular manuscript traditions in Turkey, we can see, like, again, the resonance or the traces of Hamuyeh's teachings and works um, up until the Ottoman period.
Right.
And it's very interesting. I mentioned before that we can kind of talk about like manuscript traditions in terms of like Hamuyeh's short treatises.
Hmm.
And it's interesting, we can also see something like study guides or
Right.
like um, notes to approach Hamuyeh's Mahbub or other works.
Okay.
And sometimes they focus more extensively on his discussion of certain letters, going back to the letter A, the Aleph, or other letters that figure prominently in his thought. Or sometimes they're kind of trying to work with some of the diagrams that he's presented in his works.
Right. I mean, how did those later traditions classify the Mahbub as a text? I mean, did they assign it a particular genre? Um, how do they describe it?
Yeah, it's very specifically like Sufi, very
Okay.
specific Sufi. Yeah, for some of his other short treatises, it's interesting to kind of think about like the former card catalog system or ways that like works were like cataloged in different manuscript collections. I mean, definitely some of his short treatises fall under the category of like letterism or the occult,
Hmm.
and that's also like interesting. Mahbub is very much seen as a work of Sufism,
Right.
and I think that's like significant. Like to just say like a little bit more about the Mahbub because I haven't
Hmm.
really said much about it.
Yeah.
So it's significant in terms of thinking about the structure of the work.
Yeah.
Um, Not that much has been written on this, and inshallah, more will be written on this by people. But the structure of the work, the first part of the work has many diagrams,
Hmm.
and the second part of the work, as we kind of like work more and more with it, is moving between prose and poetry, back and forth.
Right.
that's also interesting in terms of thinking about the understanding of Sufism or the understanding of Sufi discourses. And definitely Hamuyeh put a lot of importance, to use that word, on poetry.
Right.
Um, and so that speaks to something that he's um, shaping as a thinker, as a Sufi. And those works of poetry, so to speak, associated with different Sufi traditions,
Mm.
also serve as a resource for kind of understanding who Hamuyeh was, or who some of these other Sufi thinkers were from this time period. Definitely, his poetry was like preserved separately too,
Right.
and that in the some of these unedited works and
Um,
manuscript.
is there a sense in the Mahbub, like of course you get quite explicitly with the Fusus, that this is somehow a work of revelation?
um, see if I can put this into words. So it's the best way that I can put it is that Hamuyeh in the Mahbub is kind of reading and reciting face to face with the Quran.
Right.
So it's his to use this expression, his Quranic hermeneutics.
Mm.
The idea of hermeneutics would suggest that something is perhaps being brought from one place to another, or there's some kind of crossing over from one thing to another.
Mm.
Um, but it seems like this is all like apparent. This is all visible, and it's all these things that are rising to visibility. So
Mm.
that again is part of his moving back and forth and kind of radically deconstructing as he's constructing some kind of conception
Right.
of Quran.
Is this kind of face to face hermeneutics in which things are rising into appearance and I guess into fana as well. Is this something that he thinks anyone can do, or is there some sort of initiatic
So, yeah,
process?
I think that's wonderfully said. Exactly like that, and exactly for anyone. There
Right,
doesn't seem to be really any um, sense of a hierarchical structure,
right,
but it is a process. It's definitely a process.
right. So it's very much, I guess, predicated on on the self and what the self is that is, I guess, face to face with the Quran, right?
Exactly. That's very good. Yes, precisely. Exactly. Um, and that's very significant in terms of, again, thinking about um, a place of manifestation or the locus of manifestation. Then we kind of think about this idea that we see in many different Sufi texts in consideration of the I.
Right,
Um, and that of course, is open to um, letter interpretation too. If one wants to do that, it's open to letter interpretation.
right.
So that letter mysticism would find a place within that area of contemplation or consideration.
Right. I also, I mean, related to that, it kind of struck me, something which is quite interesting, which was that this whole question of when we talk about manifestation or kind of theophany sometimes, people often kind of consider that certainly in the Ibn Arabi school, that's the way in which we make sense of multiplicity, right? So
Right.
multiplicity is something which is about appearances, something phenomenal.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
whereas in this system, it's quite interesting because it's out of that phenomenal emergence of many different things that you seem to get a passing away of that as well. So the multiplicity does not arise out of the phenomenal, but it's actually unity which arises out of the phenomenal.
Yeah,
That seems
exactly.
quite interestingly different.
It's very interesting in terms of thinking also. we have this kind of going back to this idea was Hamuyeh a monist or not?
Yeah.
Uh, it's just that word monist. It just gets me every time. I can't help it. It just makes me kind of like cringe and laugh at the same time. So kind of think about like what is unity? What is
Yeah.
unitary? What is tawheed?
Mm.
And we have like in English different ways that we would talk about what is unity, what is tawheed, what is God's tawheed.
Mm.
And I think for Hamuyeh, the consideration is really like what is being, I would call it like dispersed
Mm.
or maybe even displaced into Tawheed,
Yeah.
um, even with this act of thinking.
Right.
And so that's something that has taken me like quite a while to grapple with,
Mm.
and definitely in terms of the writing of the Mahbub. This is very much like the writing style of the Mahbub is a kind of dispersal, kind of spreading out a dispersal of ideas that then go back through Fana into Tawheed.
Right. Um, can I ask you one question about the Insan Kamil?
Oh
Um,
yeah.
I'll kind of preface by saying why I'm asking this. So a number of years ago, probably about 20 years ago, I came across a short text which was published in Iran, and it was attributed to Ibn Arabi, and it was called
Oh yeah.
Haqiqat al-Haqa'iq, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I wrote an article on it, which basically translated it, and I sent it to Denis Grill, and Denis said, "Oh, this text was published in Hamuyeh's name in Cairo back in the 20s." And of course, I wasn't aware of this. But it was interesting because the doctrine that was being put forward in this text, sounded like Ibn Arabi, but uh, it didn't sound like Ibn Arabi in his text. It sounded like it might have been the Ibn Arabi school or
Right.
something which is somehow related but distinct. Um, so I guess that's why I'm, roundabout. That's why I'm asking you this question of, what role does the Insan Kamil or the concept of the Insan Kamil play in Hamuyeh's thought?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's interesting we have our venerable scholars like Denis Grill and Herman Landolt,
Yes.
and
And
also
of course, I mean, Landolt was the person from whom your Ustad, from whom I first heard of the Kitab al-Mahbub, right? So,
yeah, so we have the sort of like the strata of knowledge of texts, and this attribution of like texts or works to Ibn Arabi, which were probably like authored by Hamuyeh. So that is one of the short treatises. It's a really good example of that.
yeah,
And then we have yeah, some other treatises where we can see like Hamuyeh talking about certain things, and having some resonance with the ideas of like Ibn Arabi.
right,
For this idea that we see so much in Sufism, and we see, for example, Aziz ad-Din Nasafi
hmm,
treating at length. Hamuyeh himself doesn't really think about that
right,
perfect human being, but thinks about instead Mahbub. So Mahbub is the Wali.
right,
And so this is something that Paul and I have like talked about in different contexts and over a period of like months,
hmm,
now years. This choice of this word mahbub
right,
is meaningful and significant for thinking again about this this face-to-face relationship
hmm,
between the individual and the Quran, but also the individual and God.
right, yeah,
Yeah, and even in terms of like the terminology. of like Hamuyeh is a little bit strange. And so he uses some ideas that are something that we would recognize as like clearly very like Sufi, but then he also wants to have his own expressions
Right.
to
Yeah.
explain things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So rather than al insan al kamil mahbub.
Yeah.
Mah-
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is there any but what about this kind of notion of the Haqiqa Muhammadiyya? Is that something that comes up in this context? I mean, is the wali the mahbub because of the archetype of the prophet as mahbub?
Yeah, like yeah, so definitely we can see that as like a strand of like discourse, part of the discussion to think about everything in connection to Muhammad
Mm,
and everything in connection to um the realities, the prophetic realities of Muhammad and also of other prophets, other prophetic figures have a place in terms of thinking about some some lineages of prophethood, and then in terms of some kind of lineages of walaya.
right.
But the very specific concepts that we might find in like Ibn Arabi are not given like full voice in Hamuyeh for many different reasons, and just as like Hamuyeh studied with Najmuddin Kubra
Mm,
and is recognized as part of the Kubravi Sufi tradition, many of the ideas that we associate with the Kubrawiya
mm,
are not firmly placed in the discourse of Hamuyeh. They're
right.
there, but not in exactly the same way.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
Before we continue, and we'll come up towards wrapping up as well, I should just mention to people who've just come in that Lisa is her picture is frozen, but we've continued obviously because the audio seems to be working fine. I don't know what's happened with the picture, but anyway, we'll persevere with this until we bring this to a conclusion. Um, I so obviously in terms of this work, so you're producing an edition of the Kitab al-Mahbub, right?
Right.
And I assume you are writing, the monograph is also associated with this?
Yeah, so before yeah, so we've prepared so for the critical edition.
Mm,
This is something that we prepared a book proposal for.
right,
Um, Idea would be to have so the Arabic text with the critical apparatus
right.
would show also how Mahbub was read,
Okay,
and it would also say some different things about the manuscript traditions. And then
right,
the introduction about Hamuyeh, his biography, and another introduction um, to say something about um, messianism. That
right,
seems to still be like the the aim and the objective
right,
in terms of content of like these two introductions to structure it in that way. The other idea that we had is to do sort of like a second volume
mm,
of critical editions of some of the short treatises
right,
of Homer, and to have it as sort of a companion volume. The short treatises are very interesting, and it's great. Like you and I both know that there's people who are working in different places on different things related to Sufi texts
mm,
and philosophical texts. So this is it's a wonderful thing that we're able to be doing this kind of work, and I think it will bring a lot to the study of Islamic intellectual history.
yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I was actually going to ask you precisely that once obviously this work or the both of these volumes is out, I mean, what do you think your intervention is then in the study of Sufism? I mean, should we really think about moving on from Ibn Arabi? Because people have spent like, careers, and there's a lot of material out there on Ibn Arabi. There are,
There's,
you
there's
know,
a lot
a
of
number
things.
of editions of texts, some very good critical editions of Ibn Arabi now available. Um, so maybe it is time for the others to come out and for us to make sense of, the fact that the Sufi heritage is much more than just Ibn Arabi and Ghazali.
That's um, Ibn Arabi is wonderful, and I'm so happy I can like spend time during pandemic reading Ibn Arabi and Hamuyeh. This is like such a
Yeah.
wonderful thing. But I think one of the critical questions that Paul Bolenfot and I were like posing as we were doing this process of applying for research grants and other things is that if we think about medieval and early modern mystical messianisms,
Mm.
what did Hamuyeh bring to the consideration of a mystical messianic discourse in the late medieval, early modern period?
Yeah.
And what did this do in terms of shaping a modern messianism,
Right.
like the political and historical messianisms of modernity?
Yeah. In
So,
fact, I mean, in that vein, Matt's just asked this question about Ibn Turka and Ibn Arabi and
oh,
Hamuyeh, right?
yes, yes,
Um, because it certainly seems, I mean, there's not just the letterism, but I think even this kind of imperial conception, which you get, imperial messianic conception, which a lot of people talk about in terms of the Timurid dispensation, and then, of course, the Safavids, Mughals, and the Ottomans.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So we have like Matt doing really interesting work. We have Evrim as well, Cornel
Mm,
Fleischer.
mm,
So this examination of Hamuyeh and thinking about how he's thinking
mm,
and taking seriously what he was giving his thought to in the 13th century um, helps us to understand a lot about the history of messianisms. And in many respects, this goes into other issues about the horizon of politics, sovereignty, body politics, what is erased, what is included,
mm.
or what is occluded
Yeah.
from these histories of messianism. And so I have a sense that as we're like working more and more on bringing everything to concrete form and preparing things in different ways for publication with the critical edition, and then going back to thinking about the introductions or thinking about Hamuyeh in these
Mm,
different contexts. That there's going to be this question as well about how scholarship, modern scholarship, recently or in the past, approached more generally like what is mysticism.
yeah.
So I think that's going to give a lot of space to consider other things.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
it also seems to be, I mean, to insert an element of polemic. Um, I'm sure you're familiar with Alexander Kanish's recent book on Sufism, where he talks about how the study of Sufism is kind of caught between these insiders and the outsiders. Um,
yeah, right.
and really, I think the sort of work that you're doing uh, basically blows that up and sort of says, well, that's kind of really irrelevant, you know, because if we want to make sense of how these traditions work, the question of who's an insider and who's an outsider doesn't really apply, does it?
That's interesting. Yeah, that's right. It's interesting, I think, in some cases. And I was listening to the conversation with Matt, and it's
Yeah.
interesting we take certain categories of consideration and then we kind of put them to the side and we start thinking about other things.
Mm.
And so I think we can see like also some of our colleagues beginning to like approach this question of like mysticism as a commodity of esoteric spirituality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thinking about approaching mysticism in the 13th century or afterwards, beyond our usual like frameworks, and trying to think about new theoretical frameworks for approaching what were the questions of these particular thinkers or authors. And so I imagine, but
Mm.
I'm probably wrong, that Hamuyeh is very concerned with things messianic.
Right.
So we'll probably like underscore that as part of our conversation
Well,
today.
it'll open it up. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
and if someone wants to disagree, they have to make their case.
yeah. So I still I feel in the present moment a certain amount of hesitation um, when I'm thinking about like what was Hamuyeh's big question.
Mm.
So maybe messianism, maybe something else, and so that's useful in terms of kind of keeping um, the fires burning, forging forward and moving forward and continuing to work on this
Yeah,
critical.
but also, I mean, that's because you're a humble and very serious scholar, unlike most of us who are very hasty, and we like to get things out and can often be wrong. Um, uh, anyway, I think because we're rapidly coming up to an hour,
Yes,
I think we should really get
yes,
to a close, unless you want to continue after a break. But I think we'll draw this to a close.
that's very good. Yes,
Thank you very much. I will,
thank you.
as I've been doing, post this. We certainly have very good audio. Unfortunately, the video didn't quite work. And thank you for those who've joined for this one and who have been joining for all of these so far. I think it's been really good fun doing these conversations. They will continue being done by my colleagues at Exeter. And what's really good is that this is not the only kind of these Instagram conversations going on. We've had a whole bunch of them across the board, and I think may these shadowy presences of ours in the
Yes,
virtual kind of atmosphere continue for quite a while to come. Uh,
yes, thank you so much. This
yeah.
has been great, and yeah,
So anyway, thank you once again, Lisa. I really hope to see you at some point. Maybe in somewhere nice like Istanbul,
that's right.
or even in Iran for that matter.
Yes,
And yes, do take care. Everyone take care, and I do look forward to any feedback and you have on either this conversation or any others, which you can either email me directly, send on Instagram, or even on our YouTube channel when this is uploaded.
In a crisis like this,